The forest of Larathis had stood for thousands of years, its colossal trees older than the oldest kingdoms. Among them was the heartwood, a tree so massive and ancient that the alien people of the region believed it was alive in spirit. They had tried for centuries to cut it down after it became diseased, spreading rot to the surrounding forest. Their strongest axes shattered against its trunk. Their fire refused to burn it. Even their most advanced machines failed. And so the heartwood stood, its blackened bark a reminder of their helplessness. The alien council had gathered in the clearing again, their voices tense. The disease had spread further, and the wildlife was fleeing. Their healers had no cure, and the council feared the rot would consume the entire forest. They argued for hours, but every plan had already failed before. Then, a single human stepped forward from the crowd. His name was Daniel. He had been traveling through their lands for weeks, a stranger with a quiet manner and a sturdy axe slung over his back. He looked at the council and spoke in a calm voice that silenced the clearing. "I can take it down," Daniel said. The aliens stared at him in disbelief. Dozens had made the same promise and failed. His hands were bare, his axe was simple steel, and his frame was lean compared to their warriors. Yet there was something in his tone, something unshaken, that made them pause. The chief elder, a tall figure with silver fur and sharp eyes, stepped forward and demanded to know why they should trust him. Daniel simply replied that he had felled trees far older than himself, and that this one was no different. It was a statement that felt less like arrogance and more like fact. The next morning, Daniel walked to the heartwood alone. The forest was quiet, as if holding its breath. The tree's massive roots coiled across the earth like the backs of ancient beasts. Its trunk was wide enough that 50 of the alien villagers could not encircle it hand in hand. He ran his fingers along the rough, blackened bark, feeling the faint thrum of something alive within. Then he set his axe to the base and began to work. Each strike rang out like a drumbeat, echoing through the silent woods. The aliens gathered at a distance, whispering that he would tire within minutes, that the axe would chip, that he would soon give up like all the others. But Daniel's rhythm did not falter. His swings were measured, each one striking the same spot with uncanny precision. Chips of wood began to scatter at his feet, and the smell of fresh timber, unseen for centuries, drifted through the air. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher. Sweat streaked his brow, but he never paused. Every swing carried the same strength as the first. By afternoon, a deep wedge had formed in the trunk. The aliens began to grow restless. This was further than anyone had ever gotten. Some muttered about strange human endurance. Others began to suspect he carried some hidden technology. Daniel ignored them all, his focus fixed on the heartwood. Then, as the shadows lengthened, the tree gave a low groan like the earth itself speaking. The aliens froze. With a final series of strikes, Daniel stepped back, and the heartwood swayed. Slowly, impossibly, the ancient giant began to fall. The crash shook the ground. Dust and splinters filled the air. The aliens stared at the fallen trunk, their disbelief giving way to awe. For the first time in living memory, the heartwood was down. Daniel did not raise his arms in triumph or shout. He simply wiped his brow, leaned on his axe, and looked at the stump. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but carrying to every ear in the clearing. "This place will need another," he said. Something new to grow where this one fell. The aliens did not understand at first. But when he reached into his pack and pulled out a small living sapling, their murmurs died away. He knelt beside the stump, placing the young tree into the soil, covering its roots with care. The forest was silent again, but this time it was not with fear, it was with a strange, unshakable hope. The sapling stood small and fragile in the shadow of the fallen heartwood. Daniel pressed the soil around its roots with steady hands, then rose to face the crowd. The aliens watched in silence, their eyes shifting between the stump of the great tree and the tiny replacement. For them, the heartwood had been more than wood and leaves. It had been history, strength, and pride. Seeing it replaced by something so small felt strange, but also oddly right. The elder stepped forward, his silver fur catching the light. He asked Daniel why he had planted such a young tree when the forest was already filled with younger growth. Daniel explained that the soil beneath the heartwood was rich with memories and nutrients, a place where life could rise stronger than before. The disease that had cursed the old tree could not touch the new one if they cared for it. His voice carried no doubt, as if the truth was as simple as breathing. Some of the younger aliens knelt by the sapling, touching its slender trunk with reverence. Others murmured that it was foolish to believe a single plant could replace what had been lost. But none could deny that Daniel had done what they could not. The forest seemed lighter somehow, as if relieved of a burden. The air smelled of fresh earth and faint green life. Even the distant calls of birds had returned to the clearing. That evening, Daniel was invited to the Elders' Hall. It was a high chamber built of smooth stone, with woven tapestries depicting battles, harvests, and ancient ceremonies. A meal was set before him, and though the alien food was strange, he ate without hesitation. The elder sat across from him, watching closely. At last he asked the question that had been circling the minds of all who had seen the fall of the heartwood. How had a single human, with a simple axe, done what their strongest warriors and sharpest machines could not? Daniel paused before answering. He told the elder that strength was not just in muscle or tools, but in knowing where and how to strike. The heartwood had been weakened in ways they had not seen, but he had read its age and structure like a story written in wood. Every swing had been aimed to cut deeper into that hidden weakness until the tree could no longer stand. He added that patience was a weapon as sharp as any blade. Most gave up before the tree was ready to fall, but he had not. The elder listened, nodding slowly. He admitted that his people valued quick results and grand displays of power, but perhaps they had forgotten the strength of persistence. Daniel only smiled faintly and said that the forest would remember. Then he stood, thanked the elder for the meal, and left the hall. Outside, the night was deep and filled with the sound of wind in the leaves. The sapling stood in the clearing, its small form swaying gently as if already growing toward the stars. In the days that followed, Daniel worked alongside the villagers. He showed them how to tend the young tree, how to water it without drowning its roots, and how to keep the soil healthy. He refused any special title or reward, saying only that his part was done once they could care for it themselves. The aliens began to gather each morning to watch the sapling, finding a strange comfort in its steady presence. The fallen heartwood, once a symbol of failure, had become a place of gathering and hope. But far beyond the village, in the untouched depths of the forest, something stirred. The disease that had claimed the heartwood was not gone. It had retreated, waiting in the dark places where sunlight never reached. Whispers began to spread among the hunters who ventured too far from the paths. They spoke of black vines curling along the forest floor, of a faint rot carried on the wind. Daniel listened quietly when he heard these stories, his gaze turning to the horizon. Whatever had struck the heartwood might yet return, and if it did, they would need to be ready. The days grew warmer, and the sapling began to show signs of growth. Its leaves spread wider, catching the sunlight that filtered through the remaining canopy. The villagers took turns guarding it, following the care instructions Daniel had given. Even those who had doubted him began to see its importance. The place where the heartwood once stood was no longer a scar, but a promise. Daniel spent his mornings walking the forest. He carried his axe but rarely used it. Instead, he studied the trees, the soil, and the streams. He listened to the sounds of the birds and the movement of the wind. He spoke little, but when the hunters brought news of strange black vines, he asked precise questions. How thick were they? Did they seem alive? Did they spread quickly? His calm tone hid a deep concern. One morning, a young hunter returned pale and breathless. He claimed to have seen the vines wrap around a living tree, strangling it until the leaves fell. No fire touched them. No blade cut them. The hunters had fled, leaving the twisted trunk behind. The elders summoned Daniel at once, telling him the story in the hall. Daniel's eyes narrowed, and he asked where the tree had fallen. The hunter gave directions that led to a dark corner of the forest none had visited in years. Daniel went there the next day. The air was thick and damp, carrying a faint scent of rot. He moved carefully, stepping over tangled roots and ducking under low branches. When he reached the spot, he found the black vines exactly as described. They coiled tightly around the trunk of a dead tree, their surface glistening as if wet. Where the bark showed beneath them, it was cracked and oozing a dark resin. Daniel knelt, touched the ground, and found it cold despite the warmth of the sun above. He tried to cut one of the vines with his axe, but the blade bounced away without leaving a mark. The vines seemed to pulse faintly, as though something inside them moved. Daniel stepped back, studying them. This was no ordinary sickness. It was a living thing, feeding on the forest. He thought of the heartwood, how its rot had spread unseen for decades. Now he knew the truth. The tree had not been diseased in the natural sense. It had been under attack. When he returned to the village, Daniel told the elder what he had found. The elder's face darkened, and he confessed that stories of such vines had existed for generations. They were called the shadow roots, said to rise from the earth itself in times of imbalance. No one knew their source, but they were feared because they destroyed without rest. The elder admitted they had once tried to burn the heartwood to kill the shadow roots, but the attempt had failed and nearly consumed the forest. Daniel listened carefully, then said they could not wait for the vines to reach the sapling. If the shadow roots were allowed to spread, the new tree would die before it could grow strong. He offered to lead a small group into the forest to find where the roots began. The elder hesitated, knowing the danger, but finally agreed. He chose 3 of the best hunters to go with Daniel, each armed with spears tipped in hardened crystal. They left the next morning before sunrise. The forest was quiet as they moved deeper, the air growing cooler and heavier. Every so often, they found signs of the shadow roots, thin strands along the ground, curling around fallen branches. The deeper they went, the thicker the strands became, until they formed a black carpet beneath their feet. The hunters grew tense, their eyes darting at every sound. Daniel kept his focus ahead, following the trail as if it were a river leading to its source. By midday, they reached a hollow in the forest floor. At its center was a wide pit, and from it rose the thickest mass of shadow roots they had ever seen. They twisted upward like snakes, spreading into the forest in every direction. The ground around the pit was bare of plants, and the air smelled of decay. Daniel stood at the edge, his grip tightening on his axe. This was not just a threat to the sapling, it was a threat to the entire forest. Asterisk. The hunters looked at the pit with unease. The black mass of shadow roots shifted as if it breathed, their surfaces glistening in the dim light. Daniel crouched down, examining the way they emerged from the soil. He noticed that the roots were warm to the touch despite the air being cold. This was a living network, feeding from deep underground. It was not enough to cut the vines on the surface. They had to destroy the source. One of the hunters suggested burning them, but Daniel shook his head. Fire would only scorch the outer layers, leaving the core untouched. Another proposed using crystal-tipped spears to pierce the thickest roots, yet Daniel knew the damage would be too shallow. He ran his fingers through the soil near the pit's edge and felt a faint vibration. Whatever was feeding the shadow roots was buried far below. If they wanted to end it, they had to dig. They began clearing the loose soil, careful not to touch the thicker vines. As they dug deeper, the ground grew warmer. A foul smell rose from below, stinging their eyes. Soon, they uncovered a cluster of bulb-like growths, each the size of a man's head. They pulsed faintly, as though drawing in breath. Daniel realized these were the feeding organs of the shadow roots. Destroying them might kill the network. The question was how to do it without being overrun. Daniel told the hunters to gather resin from nearby trees. The resin burned hotter than normal wood and stuck to anything it touched. While they collected it, he fashioned a small trench around the bulbs to hold the liquid once it was lit. The hunters returned with sacks of resin, and together they poured it into the trench. The bulbs pulsed faster, as if sensing danger. Daniel struck flint against steel, sending sparks into the sticky mass. Flames leapt high, their heat driving the hunters back. The fire clung to the bulbs, burning with an intensity that filled the pit with smoke. The shadow roots writhed and twisted, pulling back from the flames. A deep, low sound rumbled through the ground, like the groan of something ancient in pain. Daniel kept feeding the fire until the bulbs blackened and split open, releasing a thick, foul-smelling steam. The roots above the pit began to shrivel, their dark color fading to ashy gray. When the last bulb cracked apart, the vibrations in the ground stopped. The roots that had reached into the surrounding forest loosened and fell limp. Daniel stood at the pit's edge, breathing hard, his face streaked with ash. The hunters looked at him with disbelief. The shadow roots had been a fear in their stories for generations, and now they lay dead before them. Yet Daniel's expression was not victory, it was caution. He knew that this might not be the only nest. They made their way back to the village, carrying samples of the burnt bulbs wrapped in cloth. The elder listened to their report in silence, his gaze heavy. He ordered the samples stored in a sealed stone chamber, away from sunlight and moisture. Daniel advised them to send scouts to search for other signs of the roots. If they found nothing, they could focus on guarding the sapling. If they found more, they would have to act quickly. The elder agreed, his tone grim. That night, the village gathered around the clearing where the sapling grew. The stars were bright above, and the young tree seemed to catch their light in its leaves. The villagers placed small stones and woven charms at its base, gifts to encourage its growth. Daniel stood a short distance away, watching. He knew the fight in the forest was far from over, but for now, the sapling was safe. The thought gave him a rare moment of peace. The next morning, scouts left in different directions, carrying enough supplies for several days. Daniel sharpened his axe, preparing to follow one of the groups into the deeper forest. The hunt for the shadow roots had begun, and with it, the hope that the Heartwood's fate would never repeat. Somewhere far beneath their feet, the earth was quiet again, but Daniel knew silence could be the most dangerous sign of all. The forest beyond the village was vast and quiet. Daniel moved with a steady pace, following one of the scout groups deeper into the unknown. The air was cool, and the ground was soft with fallen leaves. Sunlight filtered through the branches, breaking into shifting patterns on the forest floor. The scouts ahead checked for signs of the shadow roots, their eyes scanning every patch of dark soil. Daniel's hand rested on his axe, ready for whatever they might find. By midday, they came across a section of forest where the ground was bare. No grass, no bushes, only soil that seemed darker than the rest. One of the scouts knelt and touched it, then pulled his hand back quickly. The earth was warm, far warmer than the air around them. Daniel crouched down and looked closely. The soil was cracked in thin lines, and from the gaps came a faint smell of decay. He told the scouts to spread out and search for the source. They found the first vine within minutes. It was thin, winding along the base of a tree, almost blending with the bark. But when Daniel scraped it with his knife, the surface peeled away, to reveal the same black, pulsing texture he had seen before. This was not yet a full nest, but it was a sign. The shadow roots had reached this part of the forest. Daniel ordered the scouts to mark the area and continue the search. If they could trace the vines back to their origin, They might be able to destroy them before they grew stronger. Hours passed as they moved further in. The ground became uneven, with small ridges and hollows. In one hollow, they found a shallow pool of dark water. The vines coiled beneath its surface, weaving together like strands of rope. Daniel stepped into the water without hesitation, feeling the cold seep into his boots. He followed the vines with his eyes until they disappeared under a large rock. The pool smelled of rotting plants, and the stillness of the water felt unnatural. This could be the entry point to another nest. They cleared the rock with effort, revealing a tunnel beneath. The vines thickened as they descended into the dark opening. Daniel lit a torch, and the group followed him down. The air grew heavy, and the walls of the tunnel were slick with moisture. Shadows danced across the roots as the flame flickered. The deeper they went, the louder the faint pulsing sound became. It was the same rhythm they had heard at the first nest, the sound of the bulbs feeding. When they reached the bottom, the space widened into a cavern. The floor was covered in shadow roots, and in the center sat another cluster of bulbs, larger than the last. They pulsed slowly, each beat sending a shiver through the vines above. Daniel knew they could not risk letting this nest grow any further. He turned to the scouts and gave the order to prepare the resin. The men worked quickly, spreading it around the bulbs in a wide ring. The scent of the resin filled the air, sharp and bitter. Daniel struck the torch to the resin, and flames roared to life. The heat spread rapidly, and the bulbs began to writhe. The roots recoiled from the fire, curling away from the center. The sound in the cavern rose to a deep rumble, vibrating through the stone walls. Daniel kept the fire fed until the bulbs split open, spilling their foul contents onto the burning floor. The flames consumed them completely, leaving only blackened husks behind. When the last bulb burned out, the rumbling stopped. The vines on the walls hung limp, their color fading. Daniel nodded to the scouts, and they began the climb back to the surface. The sunlight above felt warmer after the cold of the cavern. Daniel looked toward the village's direction, thinking of the sapling. Every nest they destroyed gave it a better chance to grow, but he knew there could still be more hidden in the forest. That night, they returned to the village with news of their success. The elder welcomed them and listened to every detail. The people cheered, grateful for another victory against the shadow roots. Daniel, however, remained quiet. He understood that the fight was not just about cutting down nests. They had to find the cause. Until they knew why the shadow roots had returned, the forest would never truly be safe. The village slept peacefully that night, unaware of the thoughts keeping Daniel awake. He stood near the sapling, watching its leaves move gently in the night breeze. Stars shone above, and the moonlight painted the clearing in silver. The young tree was growing well, but the danger was not gone. Daniel knew that the shadow roots would not stop unless their true origin was destroyed. At dawn, he met with the elder to discuss his plan. Daniel wanted to travel far beyond the forest's known edges, into the uncharted lands where the soil had long been abandoned. He believed the roots came from a central source, a place where they had been growing for centuries without interference. The elder was hesitant. No one had crossed those lands in generations, and the stories about them were filled with warnings. But Daniel's calm conviction left little room for argument. A small group was chosen for the journey, 2 skilled hunters, 1 healer, and Daniel leading them. They packed light, but carried enough resin to burn another nest if needed. The villagers gathered to see them off, offering charms for protection and food for the road. The sapling stood behind them, a silent reminder of what they were fighting for. Daniel gave it one last look before turning to the path ahead. The first days of travel were quiet. The forest grew wilder as they moved away from the village, the trees taller and the undergrowth thicker. Streams ran clear, and the air was filled with the calls of unseen birds. But gradually, the signs began to change. The ground darkened. and patches of lifeless earth appeared more often. The air felt heavier, and the silence between animal calls grew longer. The group moved cautiously, their weapons always within reach. On the fourth day, they reached a ridge overlooking a vast plain. The land below was stripped of all green, the soil cracked and black. In the center, far in the distance, something glimmered faintly in the sunlight. Daniel studied it for a long moment before speaking. That was where they needed to go. The hunters agreed without question, though their faces showed unease. The healer tightened her grip on her staff, her eyes fixed on the strange glow, crossing. The plain was difficult. The ground crumbled under their boots, and deep fissures forced them to take long detours. In some cracks they saw the thick coils of shadow roots, unmoving but still pulsing faintly. The further they went, the more the air smelled of rot. By the time they reached the glowing object, the sun was beginning to set. What they found was not what they expected. It was a crystal, taller than a man, half buried in the earth and surrounded by a web of roots. The crystal's surface pulsed with dim light, and each pulse matched the faint movement of the surrounding roots. Daniel approached cautiously, feeling a strange vibration in the air. This was the heart of the shadow roots, the source that fed them. The hunters readied their weapons, but Daniel knew blades would be useless here. They needed fire, but more than that, they needed to break the crystal itself. The resin would burn the roots, but the crystal had to be shattered. They poured resin in a wide circle around the crystal, setting small channels to guide the flames inward. Daniel placed his axe against the crystal, testing its strength. It did not crack, but it rang with a hollow sound, as if something inside was waiting to be released. The hunters lit the resin, and fire rushed through the channels. The roots recoiled violently, twisting and snapping in the heat. Daniel raised his axe high and struck the crystal with all his strength. The first blow left only a shallow mark, but the sound it made was louder, like a bell ringing in the deep earth. He struck again, and cracks began to spread across its surface. With the third strike, the crystal shattered, releasing a blinding flash of light. The roots convulsed and then collapsed, their black color fading to gray ash. The fire consumed them quickly, leaving the plain covered in smoke and silence. Daniel stood still, breathing hard, as the last flames burned out. The hunters lowered their weapons, and the healer stepped forward to examine the shattered crystal. It was nothing but shards now, lifeless and cold. The source of the shadow roots was gone. Daniel looked toward the horizon, thinking of the sapling. For the first time since he had arrived in the village, he allowed himself to believe that might grow without fear. The return journey began under a pale morning sky. The air over the plain felt lighter now, the heavy scent of rot gone. Daniel and his group moved more quickly, their steps steady and sure. The hunters carried the largest shard of the shattered crystal as proof of their victory. The healer kept watch for any sign of the shadow roots trying to regrow, but the ground lay still and silent. Even the wind seemed warmer as it moved across the land. Crossing back into the forest, they found the trees greener and the streams clearer than before. The change was subtle but real. Birds sang more often, and small animals moved freely without hesitation. Daniel noticed the difference and allowed himself a quiet nod. This was the forest beginning to heal. The group camped that night under a canopy of stars, the fire between them burning low but steady. No strange noises disturbed their rest. When they reached the village, the people gathered in excitement. Word of their approach had spread quickly. The elder came forward to meet them, his silver fur bright in the sun. The hunters presented the crystal shard, and the crowd gasped at its dark, fractured surface. Daniel explained that the crystal had been the heart of the shadow roots, and destroying it had ended their spread. The elder listened carefully, then thanked them in a voice heavy with both relief and gratitude. That evening, the village held a feast. Long tables were set up in the clearing, covered with food and drink. Music played, and the air was filled with the sound of laughter. Daniel sat with the hunters, speaking little but listening to their stories. The healer joined him, telling of the small changes she had already noticed in the forest's plants. The sapling was greener than before, and its leaves had a stronger shine. It was as if the young tree already felt the freedom from the shadow roots. The elder stood to speak, raising his hand for silence. He told the people that their forest had been saved not by strength alone, but by patience, skill, and the will to see the task through. He spoke of Daniel's courage in facing dangers that others would not, and of the unity shown by the hunters and healer. The crowd cheered, calling Daniel's name, but he only inclined his head, uncomfortable with the praise. For him, the work had simply been necessary. In the days that followed, Daniel helped the villagers repair areas of the forest that had been damaged. They cleared dead roots, planted new seedlings, and restored the flow of water to streams blocked by decay. The sapling in the clearing continued to grow, its roots deepening into the soil once poisoned by the heartwood's fall. Each morning, Daniel checked on it before starting the day's work, making sure it was strong and well protected. One morning, a group of young villagers asked Daniel to teach them how to use an axe properly. He agreed, showing them how to hold it, how to measure each swing, and how to strike with precision. They listened closely, eager to learn. Daniel told them that cutting a tree was not about speed or power, but about understanding the tree itself. The lesson was simple, but they understood its deeper meaning. Every action required patience and purpose. As the forest continued to recover, visitors from nearby settlements began arriving. They had heard of the fall of the heartwood and the planting of the new tree. Some came out of curiosity, others to offer help. Daniel welcomed their aid but warned them to respect the forest's balance. The elder spoke with each group, sharing the story of what had happened and the importance of guarding against threats like the shadow roots in the future. One evening, Daniel stood alone in the clearing, watching the sun set behind the trees. The sky burned with shades of orange and gold, and the sapling's leaves caught the light like small flames. The air was calm, and the forest was alive with gentle sounds. For the first time in many weeks, Daniel felt that his purpose here was nearly complete. But in his heart, he knew there was still one thing left to do before he could truly rest. The final task Daniel had in mind was one he had been considering since the heartwood fell. He wanted to leave behind something more than just a single sapling. The forest was large, and though the shadow roots had been destroyed, time would test its strength again. He decided to plant more trees in places where the soil was ready, creating a living chain of growth that would protect the land. For generations, the elder agreed to his plan and gathered volunteers. They prepared young trees, each chosen for its strength and ability to thrive in the forest's climate. The healer selected areas where the ground was rich and the sunlight steady. Daniel led the group from site to site, planting each tree with the same care he had shown to the sapling. The work was slow but steady, and the days passed in quiet labor, broken only by the sounds of shovels and the rustle of leaves. As they worked, Daniel shared his knowledge with the villagers. He showed them how to protect a young tree from storms, how to keep pests away without harming the soil, and how to cut only what the forest could spare. His lessons were simple but lasting. The younger ones listened with wide eyes, already imagining themselves as the forest's future guardians. The older ones took pride in knowing their home would be stronger than before. By the time the planting was done, the forest held many new points of green life. The villagers began calling the trail of young trees the path of renewal. The sapling in the clearing had grown taller, its trunk thicker, and its leaves a brighter green. Each evening, the people gathered near it, speaking of the day's work and the changes they saw in the forest. It became a place of unity, a sign that their struggle had meaning. One night, a gentle rain fell, soaking the soil around the new trees. Daniel walked the path in the quiet darkness, stopping at each planting to check the ground. The rain carried the scent of fresh earth and clean air. He could feel the life of the forest returning, a pulse that matched his own heartbeat. By the time he returned to the clearing, the sapling's leaves glistened under the soft light of the moon. The next morning, the elder called the village together. He spoke of the journey they had taken from the fear of the heartwood's rot to the hope of the new forest. He praised the courage of every person who had faced danger, but he gave special thanks to Daniel. The elder declared that as long as the sapling stood, Daniel's name would be remembered in their history. The villagers cheered, their voices carrying into the trees. Daniel stood quietly, his gaze fixed on the sapling. Later that day, Daniel prepared to leave. His work here was finished, but the forest's future now belonged to its people, the hunters. And the healer came to see him off, along with many of the villagers. The elder handed him a small carved token, shaped like a tree, a gift of gratitude and a promise that he would always have a place among them. Daniel accepted it with a simple nod, his pack already on his shoulder. Before stepping onto the road, Daniel turned one last time to the clearing. The sapling swayed gently in the breeze, its young branches reaching toward the sky. He knew it would grow into a great tree, and that its roots would anchor more than soil. They would anchor the memory of what had been done here. With that final thought, he set his eyes on the horizon and began walking, his steps steady and unhurried. The forest was alive again, and the people were ready to protect it. The path of renewal would grow stronger each year, linking the past to the future. And though Daniel's journey would take him far away, his mark would remain in every leaf, every branch, and every root. The heartwood was gone, but in its place stood something greater, a living testament to resilience and care.